Hey guys, and welcome back to the Yes Means Yes podcast. As always, my name is Faith Nomchef, and I'm the ARP Outreach and Counseling Coordinator with Rape Counselors of East Alabama. On this episode, we're going to be talking with Regan Moss about gender-based violence and menstrual discrimination and kind of the intersection of those two. We also have on one of our interns today, Shayna. It is her podcast debut, so I'm going to let Shayna and Regan introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with the podcast.
Hi, I'm Shayna. I am in the grad program at Kent School at University of Louisville, getting my Master's of Science in Social Work with a concentration in mental health therapy.
Great. I'm Regan Moss. I'm presently an MPH student at Columbia University and studying all things menstrual health, maternal health, repro health. And I'm on the board of directors for an organization called PERIOD, which works to fight period poverty and social stigma around menstruation.
Awesome. Well, we're very excited to have you on, Regan. Just to give the listeners a little bit of a background, what kind of got you into this line of work, wanting to work with menstrual, inequality and discrimination, and how did you end up where you are today?
Yeah, I always trying to think back to the first period that I had, because I think for a lot of people, those early childhood experiences really craft the things that they're passionate about and the things that they want to help address when they're older. And the first time that I really remember having a period, it ended with me passing out on the kitchen floor because I was in so much pain. And present day still really trying to grapple with what is causing that pain, but it really made me consider all of the misinformation and the lack of information we have about menstrual health. And so, like most people, I went on social media, went all through, so many different websites, really trying to understand like the history behind menstruation and why we know so little, why American gynecology can be really, really harmful towards people. And I came across an organization called PERIOD. And since then, there are, of course, so many hundreds of other nonprofits and organizations doing similar work to PERIOD. But PERIOD really stuck out to me because it was youth-led and it was really focused on grassroots development and letting people focus on their communities and working to support the infrastructure and the capacity of nonprofits to do their jobs well. Since then, I feel like I've constantly had so many reminders of why this work is really important. I started a chapter period in 2019 when I was living in Alabama and constantly was having conversations with people that were in their 50s and trying to understand what perimenopause was, but also girls that were in high school or LGBTQ youth in college, really trying to grapple with gender identity and menstruation. So yeah, my initial reason for getting involved was confusion about my own body. But present day, there are hundreds of reasons why I'm in this work.
Thank you for sharing about your background and your personal history. I think that you're 100% correct. Usually, in the helping services field, we kind of find ourselves in areas in which we kind of wish we had one of us there to be there to educate or talk to, or, whatever it is. I will say that the period organization you're discussing actually really helped us out with some of our 2020 COVID outreach things, because they give us a bunch of free menstrual products and we were able to add, just a small sticker about us on them and take them to hotels, motels in the Auburn, Opelika area that were especially known for human trafficking. So that was a really great way for us to do outreach without being out in the community in such a dangerous time. So I can, say firsthand that work that they're doing is allowing us to reach people in ways that we may not have been able to before. So we have always appreciated, partnering with them. To take it a little bit back, for people listening, if they're not familiar with this topic, can you describe what menstrual discrimination is?
Yeah, good question. So I'm not really sure if there's been any academic article, or some brief that's really coined that term and defined it, but it's really commonly being used in spaces that are working on improving menstrual health and decreasing instances of period poverty and stigma, because it's really able to capture all of these social ideologies and social forces that have led to the discrimination of people that menstruate and the taboos around menstruation. So essentially, menstrual discrimination is discriminatory behavior or acts and ideas about people that menstruate that really weaponizes the fact that you have different experiences when you're bleeding as compared to other parts of your cycle, just really building on all of the needs that people have, like psychologically, socially, biologically, while they're menstruating.
Thank you for sharing that. I know that even for me working in the human services field, like there's so many sectors that you can get into, right? So this is a topic that, while I've heard of it because we worked with Period before, there's still a lot for me to learn. So I'm sure others out there feel similarly. So thank you for that clarification on what exactly it is.
Regan, a question that I had after like reading your blog was what examples could you give or have you seen of like overt discrimination that has been so normalized that we may not even notice it? And then also on the other hand, covert forms of discrimination.
Yeah, great question. I think the overt stuff is honestly a lot of what Period is trying to tackle day to day. So one of the best examples I can think of, right? We walk into a restroom, most instances we're guaranteed there's going to be a toilet paper in the stalls. But period products, if they're in the restroom, you likely are paying to have those products. And that's a really clear form of menstrual discrimination, a lack of access in a variety of spaces, schools, business spaces, public spaces, leads to people not being able to fully participate in whatever they're wanting to do day to day. If it is go to school, if it is to go to work, if it's to go out with friends and enjoy their evening, they're not able to do so, which in many instances has been raised as a Title IX violation and a reason for colleges to get involved with it. It's been raised as an issue around workers' rights, but really fundamentally it's an issue of human rights and people not being able to exist in whatever space they're in because these really, really basic tools are not being provided. And I think something that's a little more covert or something we might not necessarily see day to day, at least not all of us. So I conducted a study my senior year interviewing people that were incarcerated in the state of Alabama. And they were incarcerated across several different facilities. Some of the people that we were talking to were even moved out of state at different points in time, but pretty consistently, they were made to feel ashamed because of their bodily functions. It was made to be their responsibility to be clean and hygienic. And of course, there's an entire history around the very concept of hygiene and utilizing that to discriminate against people. But one of the interviewees that we were speaking to like broke down crying when we were in the middle of our interview because they shared that the way that guards made them feel when they were on their period and acted like they were disgusting, or if they acted for additional period products, seeming really put out by that, it reminded them of the abuse that they were experiencing prior to being incarcerated, and how their just day-to-day function was subjected to someone else's control. And in that instance, their ability to control their finances, to shower when they wanted to, and all of those things parallel into prisons where we are excusing in a lot of instances gender-based violence. And so I think it's covert in that way because a lot of people think if there's any instance of criminality, those rights go away. But when you really try and think about how deeply that parallels other forms of gender-based violence, it's really easy to understand, I think, what menstrual discrimination looks like.
So you mentioned the word gender-based violence. Can you further explain, that kind of intersection we see between gender-based violence and menstrual discrimination?
Yeah, there's so many overlaps. I think if you think about the disgust that a lot of cis men have towards women when they're on their period and not wanting to be intimate, which is a whole conversation around consent when it comes to sex and periods, but just intimacy in general. When people are on their periods and wanting to be affirming of people's emotions, that's a pretty clear instance of gender-based violence when people are put down, when they share their emotions with their partners, or they're made to feel like they're crazy, or they're hysteric. All of those myths about like crazy women really come about in so many instances because of the myths we have around premenstrual syndrome and different symptoms that people have on their cycle. Some other instances, I think if you just go through Twitter threads and Reddit threads, you can see people sharing stories about menstruation where they were made to feel really, really scared or nervous around their partners, but also just out and about. The instance that I shared in prisons is a really clear example, but in other instances, people are in school and they're trying to ask their teacher to go to the restroom, and the teacher shames them, right? Because they're getting up again to go to the restroom. And so I think it kind of broadens the lens of what we see as being gender-based violence and gender discrimination, and how in a lot of instances it is physical and it is sexual, but it also can be emotional and social. And those things are just as impactful and just as much a human rights violation as instances of sexual and physical violence.
So this last question kind of answered, that your answer to it, but why is it so important that we talk about this equality, especially, in our lines of work and where we intersect between, sexual assault and sexual violence, that gender-based violence, and menstrual equality and access to products?
Yeah, and I mean, it cuts across so many different issues. And I think it can really speak to so many different listeners, regardless of what field or what lens they're coming to this issue from. So for people that are interested in adolescence and gender empowerment, 1 in 4 adolescents in the United States alone miss school because they do not have access to period products. That's not even considering the numbers of students that are missing because they have really, really bad cramps and they're in pain, right? Or students who don't have access to products within the rest. Like there's so many other uncounted students. But I think knowing that 25% of students are consistently missing so many valuable class days, to me, is really terrifying. And trying to imagine those students then, having an equal playing field when it comes to applying to colleges, engaging in the workplace. You can just see the issue transcending across decades and generations. I think another reason, kind of ditching the numbers-based argument, is when you tackle period poverty and menstrual discrimination, you're really, in a lot of instances, addressing gender inequality and also a lot of other cyclical aspects of poverty outside of hygiene-based poverty. A lot of people that are experiencing period poverty are also experiencing homelessness or economic insecurity. And we know that there's a gender gap when it comes to experiences of homelessness and economic insecurity. So again, addressing gender inequality when we're tackling period poverty, and we're making sure that people are included in work and in school when they're on their cycles. And then I always try and remember people that, I mean, there are obviously millions of people that are in school and at work, but there are also millions of people that are at home, millions of people that are without jobs. And being able to function in your day-to-day, regardless if you're leaving the house or if you're sitting at home on Zoom calls, if you're a mom and you're taking care of your children, being able to really recognize the psychological and the social repercussions of not being able to have autonomy over your day, I think can really help to capture all of those people that are not in school and work, but still deserve to be able to, move about their space freely and govern their lives how they wish to.
I think that was a really great explanation, even as we started doing this podcast and you said the thing about schools. That was something I'd never even thought of. Like, we have programs in which provide free lunches for students who are economically disadvantaged, but I've never even thought about, like, okay, what if their families cannot afford menstrual products, right? Like, do they choose to go to school or do they choose to stay home? Do they have to, face the stigma of going to a school nurse or asking a friend, which is a whole other barrier, especially when you're looking at teenagers who, those things are not comfortable topics. We talk about taboo. So I think organizations like yours are so important because we're talking about it and we're normalizing the conversation around, menstruators having periods and just making it sounds like easier. And we're going to use that very loosely because there's still a lot of work to be done, as always, to access products or to feel comfortable accessing products. So I think that that's great. And I think that the work that Period does is so essential and something that, me speaking for me, I didn't even think about a lot of those aspects until now. So,
yeah. And I'll emphasize too, so Alabama did pass a bill not this legislative session that just ended, but the year before, that established a grant program for Title I schools to be able to apply and get period products for their students, which is huge. It's obviously not enough because those, schools are having to apply to something that does have a cap on the funding. But in so many other states, they're also recognizing that these products need to be in the stalls, they need to be in the bathrooms. And when we were at Auburn, our period chapter was able to get free period products on the university campus. And it actually became a really great way to raise awareness around menstrual discrimination, the lack of menstrual education during adolescence and into adulthood. And we were able to bring together so many different offices that had a stake in this issue outside of our chapter. So I think it really is a cross-cutting issue and can engage people in so many different fields.
definitely agree. And I think it's nice now that for so long, every nonprofit or, issue-based sector kind of had their own lane, but I think we're all coming to the realization now that everything is so interconnected that it's impossible for us to stay in our own lane anymore if we're really going to address the issues. So I think it's great that, organizations like that are able to reach out to other organizations, especially within the college spaces, because college students aren't entirely known for having extra money, and menstrual products may fall into that category. So I think that that's great that you were able to, especially get involved in a school in Alabama. We talked a lot about access to products, and when we talk about essential products, that's like food, water, would include menstrual products, those sorts of things. So how would you say the access, or even the lack of in a lot of instances, reflect the overarching power dynamics in our modern culture?
Yeah, I mean, the one that most often comes to mind is this creation of a concept of hygiene, because being able to use period products and manage your period has nothing to do with hygiene, right? That's like a basic need. But the concept of hygiene I bring up because oftentimes we tie that to personal responsibility, which means we also tie it to laziness or failure of that person to show up and participate in the ways that we expect people to. So I think that definitely reflects the ideas we have around people that are economically disadvantaged or facing economic insecurity. But I think also the whole issue of period poverty is so solvable. And the fact that we haven't solved it is because the government and all these other institutions are so deeply sexist. If there were women in power in every single office leading this, there's no doubt that it would have been solved decades ago. And the mere fact that people can't talk to their employers about it, can't even talk to their partners about it sometimes, or their parents about it, really just shows that the silencing of this because of sexism has created an issue that never had to exist to begin with.
And I would also argue that that goes even deeper to just vagina having people. Vaginas are gross. That has been kind of the concept, the underlying message that at least I know I was given growing up, whether it was very obvious or just kind of a subconscious thing. So it definitely adds to that narrative, I would say.
For sure. And I think that's really evident too when you ask people, or I mean, there's so many blogs of people describing their experiences with period poverty, and the common theme is that they felt gross because of all these messages, whether they're being spoken to them directly or they're perceiving them in their social environment. They're made to feel disgusting. Again, all tying back to these really, really basic biological functions and the parts of our body that make up largely women, but also people that are intersex and non-binary and transgender. And that's something I think should be emphasized too. A lot of efforts to tackle period poverty and stigma completely exclude people that are intersex, non-binary, and transgender. And those people we know experience period poverty more than cis women. So it's an issue for sure around LGBTQ rights as well.
Regan, I had a question. So you've used the term period poverty several times, and I was just wondering if you could dig a little bit into that and what exactly that means.
Yes. So it's actually kind of a contentious term, I would say, sometimes in menstrual health spaces. So it was coined in Scotland because the original way that it was recognized is after people had given birth and they were in postpartum and really heavily bleeding, they were noticing that a lot of their patients were unable to, buy maxi pads and sustain that throughout the postpartum period where there's a lot of heavy bleeding. So they coined the term period poverty then to really recognize this lack of access to products. I think since then it's evolved into, yes, the lack of access to products, whether that's a function of stigma, of economic insecurity, or the context, meaning like it should be at school, it's not at school, you're caught by surprise. But a lot of other groups have also started to challenge what else do we overlook, because this is predominantly a women's issue, that is also impacting people's ability to take care of themselves while they're on their periods. And so this definition of period poverty relating to a lack of access to period products has now expanded to also being a lack of access to medically accurate, culturally congruent, inclusive menstrual education, oftentimes sex ed as well. But also a lack of access to clean water and to toilets and to private washrooms where people are able, to use the restroom in privacy.
Yeah, it's amazing as someone who has menstruated most of my life, like still learning because of the lack of conversation or education. Like you would think as someone who menstruates, you would be a professional, or you would have all these answers or be aware of all of these things. But yeah, it's just incredible how much you can still learn. And I was just curious, like, what are ways, whether you're an individual who menstruates or one who does not, like what can be done to help the cause, or more specifically, starting with people who do not menstruate at a young age. Where do we start to tackle these difficult conversations?
Yeah. Fortunately, there are so many different ways. And so I think if someone is, uncomfortable in one way or one way is inaccessible to them, there's so many ways that we can start these conversations. I would say the first thing is your self-awareness around period poverty and stigma. And I think a really cool exercise is while you're on your period, journaling what you're doing, 8 a.m. Okay, I wake up, I put on a pad. Maybe there's blood on my sheets. I have a laundry machine and I wash my bed sheets. At the end of the day, going back and looking at those things and being like, okay, I had access to period products. I had access to a laundry machine. I had control over my ability to use those things, right? And really reflecting on if I was in someone else's shoes, if I was incarcerated, if I was homeless, would I have been able to go about my day the way that I did comfortably? The answer is probably no. And I think that's a really good way to see the nuances of period poverty in addition to period products. I would say as far as engaging people who don't menstruate, that really begins with quality sex education while people are in school. Menstrual education, a lot of us in the menstrual health space believe that should be given in outside of sex ed, but for sure included in sex ed. And I say that because we know that good sex education is developmentally appropriate. And we know that good menstrual education should be repeated over time. So what that really results to is people when they're in second and third grade who might not have started their period yet, some people will, being introduced to the concept of a period, being able to have conversations within their classroom, but also the classroom being able to bridge the gap with caregivers and being able to open up conversations, provide educational materials. And this is regardless of someone's gender. People need to be aware that people bleed. Here are period products. This is a normal aspect of everyday life for millions of people. And if we really include it into early education and we repeat it over time, in addition to normalizing conversations in sex ed, this stigma goes away. And we know that, right, when we look at things like sex education and when people are introduced these concepts, people are more likely to ask for consent. Either, STDs decrease, or STIs, rates of STIs decrease, unintended pregnancies decrease. And that's because people have knowledge about their bodies. But we also know that stigma around sex decreases and people are more comfortable having conversations with their partners. And we know that same thing is going to happen with menstrual education as well. They're going to be more comfortable talking to their providers, their teachers, their peers, and their parents about menstruation when we normalize the conversation.
So yeah, sounds like there's lots of ways that you can get involved if you would wish to. If anyone is in an area where they have like a period organization like yours, or they don't know if they have one, is there a way people can reach out to that organization or find if there's one near them or get involved with them?
Yeah, for sure. And I also realized I missed an aspect of your question, so I'll come back and answer that as far as like how people can get involved. So there are period chapters in most states. Period also has international chapters. For people listening within Alabama, there's Period.Auburn, Alabama, that group that I founded, but there is also Women in Training. There's an organization called the Monthly Project. There's Bundles of Hope Diaper Bank, who also provides period products. So there are a lot of organizations, and on the Period website, you can look up your state and see what chapters exist within your state, within your county, school, wherever you'd be interested in connecting. And then as far as other nonprofits, a lot of what Period does is tied to the Alliance for Period Supplies and the National Diaper Bank. So not like a plug for them since I don't represent them, but I think they're incredible. And by visiting their websites, you can also identify so many other organizations who are working outside of the Period network to tackle these issues as well. And then I would say anyone who's interested in getting involved, but maybe doesn't have the time or the capacity or the ability to engage with a Period chapter or one of our partners. It can be a small thing, but a really, really helpful thing, to just hang up posters in your classroom or posters at work, acknowledging that period poverty and stigma exists. It's a human rights issue. And, here's a website or an organization near you where you can go get resources. But there's also a lot of momentum on the federal level and the state level as far as improving access to period products, improving access to menstrual education, and removing the luxury tax on period products and diapers. So if people, don't have the capacity to volunteer, they don't have the financial capacity to donate period products, they can also make sure they vote for people that are going to advocate for these needs on the state level and the federal level.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing some of those more examples that they're able to do that. And that honestly makes me want to go and look now in North Carolina, in the Raleigh area where I'm at. What resources do we have? Do we need more resources? And hopefully that also causes more people to think about that from their perspectives and their areas. So thank you for sharing. We end the podcast with the same question that we ask all of our guest presenters. And we ask them, what is your message to survivors, particularly survivors of sexual violence, because that is the group our organization serves.
Yeah, so I kind of reflected on a message to people that have survived instances of sexual interpersonal violence and also survivors of period poverty. So I'll start with the period poverty portion. I hope anyone listening that has experienced that would know if that instance was circumstantial or if it was consistent, regardless of the reason. Their experience of period poverty reflects the larger system, and it's not a result of any insufficiencies on their part. And I would say to people that have experienced sexual violence or gender-based violence that your experience doesn't have to look like everyone else's in order for it to be valid, right? So I gave examples of people experiencing emotional abuse because of their period. That is, you deserve support for that just as much as you would if you've experienced sexual violence. And so I hope people don't compare their stories to other people, and they recognize that there's support for them regardless of what they have experienced.
Thank you for joining us today, Regan, and for providing all this information. I think that, all the work that you were able to do in your time in Auburn was awesome. And I always look forward to either seeing you on my LinkedIn or a random Auburn Instagram, always doing great things. So I'm glad that you were able to be a champion in our sector of the world for a little bit. And I'm excited to see, what you do up in the East Coast. But again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for talking about this. Definitely sounds like an area of expertise for you. And we just always appreciate our guests coming on. And again, thank you. Thank you for taking your time.
Yeah, thank you, Regan. It was
nice. Thank you all so much. You as well. Thank you guys so much for building this platform for people. I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me.
Yeah. Well, to our listeners out there, that is the end of our podcast today. And we will see you on the next one. Bye.